In Chapter 1 of Biology 1406, we're going to cover just kind of an introduction of what biology is and the foundations and fundamentals of what make biology the science that it is. So, this is a course that's all about just kind of general biology. There, of course, are more specific ways in which you can learn about different biological sciences. But in general, biology is the scientific study of life. Bio meaning living, right? And biologists might ask certain questions like how does a single cell develop into an organism? An organism being the animal, the thing, like a plant, the living thing would be the organism. They might ask how the human mind works. They might ask how different forms of life in the forest would interact with one another, um, talking about prey and predation, that kind of thing. So they ask a lot of different questions, and that's just a couple of examples of it. They, the point is that they might ask questions as simple as a cell to as large as how an ecosystem might interact with one another. So, in general, people like to organize things so that they make sense, and biologists definitely do that as well. There are 5 unifying themes that organize biological information. So I would definitely know these 5 themes, and then I would understand what all of these 5 themes mean to biology. Organization, information, energy and matter, interactions, and evolution is the unifying theme for biology. So, as far as organization goes, life can be studied, of course, at different levels, from as tiny as a molecule to studying the whole entire living planet. The study of life can be divided into different levels of biological organization, and we are going to look at that. And then in reductionism, complex systems are reduced to simple components so that they're more manageable for us to study. So a microbiologist might be somebody that studies microbes, very tiny things, little small organisms, but they're still considered a biologist. Then there are biologists that study whole ecosystems. So biologists can study a broad range of things, but we like to compartmentalize these subjects into easier to understand, more manageable things that can be studied. If you look at kind of the hierarchy of life here, we start out with things that are the most inclusive. The biosphere is the biggest thing that includes living things. The biosphere in this case is Earth. Then you break down the biosphere into ecosystems. A group of ecosystems make up an entire biosphere. Communities make up ecosystems. So now we get even smaller. So an ecosystem might be this prairie land or whatever this area is in the picture, but then there are separate communities that make that up. Flowers, grass, trees, deer, microbes in the soil, etc., etc. Whole communities. Populations would be individual ones of those things. So a population would be a group of just deer or a group of all of those bluebonnets right there. The organism would be the single bluebonnet that's pulled out, or the single deer. And then for organs, if we're looking at the case of the bluebonnet, an organ would be maybe the leaf. An organ of a deer would be its liver, right? Those organs are made up of groups of tissues. Those tissues are made up of cells. Those cells are made up of molecules. Those cells are made up of organelles, which are like organs within the cell, and those organelles are made up of molecules. So the most inclusive thing is this biosphere, number one, and we're becoming less and less inclusive as we move up the numbers. Emergent properties are those that result from the arrangement and interaction of parts within a system. They can also be non-biological entities as well. So if you think about a bicycle, if all of the parts are not connected correctly, if all these emergent properties don't happen correctly, then the bicycle wheels cannot turn and the chain on the wheel can't force the wheels to move if you move your pedals. Biologists today complement reductionism with systems biology, which is the exploration of a biological system by analyzing the interactions among its parts. So the systems approach poses questions like, how do networks of genes in our cells function to generate our 24-hour cycle of wakefulness and sleep? Why do genes make us want to go to bed when it's nighttime and wake up when it's morning time? Or how does increasing carbon dioxide alter our biosphere? At each level of that biological hierarchy that I showed you, we'll find a correlation between structure and function. And so a biologist might analyze biological structure to give clues about what it does and how it works. So for instance, I am an entomologist, which is the study of insects, and I'm able to look at an insect and look at structures on its body, such as its legs, and determine what it might do, whether it digs in the ground, whether it flies and flies for long distances versus short distances, whether I can look at its mouth parts and determine what type of food it might be feeding on. So you can look at biological structures to give clues about how things work. Structure fits function. The structure of something tells you what its function is in the world. So let's look at a cell. A cell is the organism's basic unit of structure and function. It's the smallest unit that can perform all of the activities of life, all of the things that make something a living thing. It's the smallest thing that can do that. It's not an organism, it's a part of an organism, but it's the smallest unit of life that can perform all of those required activities that make something living. All cells share certain characteristics, such as being enclosed by a membrane so that the guts of the cell are held tight, just like we have skin that encloses our organs and we're not just kind of a blob. A cell is kind of the same thing. And there's two types of cells that we're going to look at, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And you guys are hopefully going to have a lab that coincides with this so that you understand really in depth what prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells mean. Eukaryotic cells are more advanced. These are cells that have membrane-enclosed organelles. They also have a nucleus that contains the DNA. So if we took skin cells from our hands, if we pulled our hair out and looked at the cells in our hair, any cell in our body is going to contain our DNA. So when you watch crime shows and they're looking for leftover DNA that someone has left at a crime scene, they're looking for a follicle of hair. They're looking for skin that was left behind. They're looking for tissue underneath the fingernails of the person that was murdered, maybe to see if they can link that DNA with someone in some system. Some organelles of a eukaryotic cell, like a chloroplast, are only in certain types of eukaryotic cells. So like a chloroplast is something that's only found in plant cells. Eukaryotic cells, there's plant cells and animal cells, and there are some organelles that are in only one or the other, but for the most part, organelles are found in both plant and animal. Prokaryotic cells are very simple cells. These were the first living things. These were the first type of cells. They were around before there was ever eukaryotic cells. They have no nucleus. They just have DNA just kind of around in there. And they don't really have membrane-bound organelles, so they're extremely simple. Usually they're very small. You can see in the picture on the right, the prokaryotic cell in proportion to a eukaryotic cell, very, very, very tiny. And that eukaryotic cell has all those different colored things inside there. That's trying to demonstrate to you different types of organelles that themselves are enclosed in some sort of membrane so that everything isn't just fluid and flowing around inside there. And I think it's chapter 2 or 3, I believe, we're going to really get into depth about what cells do. Probably one of the most important components of a cell is this thing called DNA. So one of the themes, life's process, involves the expression and transmission of genetic information. Genetic information is called DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. And these are two pictures. The kind of squiggly blue stuff, purpley stuff in the middle is DNA. Picture on the right hand side is DNA. This is a cell that's splitting, and the DNA has replicated itself, and so you're going to have equal amounts of DNA on either side. But DNA is extremely important. It tells us who we are, and it tells our cells what they're supposed to do. A DNA molecule holds hundreds of thousands of genes. So each DNA strand holds various genes that make us who we are. And genes are the units of inheritance. You get half of your genes from mom and half of your genes from dad. And cells start to grow and divide, and that genetic information is duplicated, and every cell that we have has the same DNA in it. So whether you take hair cells, skin cells, liver cells, cells from the inside of your cheek, the DNA is going to be the same no matter what. Blood cells, all of it has DNA. So mom is the egg, right? Dad is the sperm. Dad has his own DNA, mom has her own DNA. That joins together to make a fertilized egg, which is the start of us. That egg will replicate and get bigger and bigger, and it becomes a ball of cells. The same DNA is in every single tiny cell. And as that thing develops and develops and develops in the womb, it finally becomes a baby or a human, an offspring, which contains genetic information from both parents. So if you aren't sure who your mom or dad is, maybe you're adopted, you can do DNA testing and you're able to tell with fairly good certainty based on their genetic information and your genetic information if you are or are not related. So this kind of shows you a DNA molecule. DNA molecule is kind of like a ladder that's been twisted so it curls. So it has two stabilizing sides and rungs of a ladder that are connected, and we call it a double helix. I would just kind of know in general what it looks like, but we're going to get into more depth in this in either this semester or also it'll be discussed in the following semester for 1407. DNA makes the blueprints for making proteins, and proteins are what make tissues and things. So you've got proteins in your muscles, you've got proteins in everything that you are. And so DNA provides the building blocks, the blueprints to build the proteins to make us start to look like what we are. Gene expression is something, it's the process of converting information from the gene to the cellular product. So when there's a miscommunication in gene expression, the information that the gene has isn't given to the cells and something goes wrong. You have mutations and deformities in the physical look of what something is. Another term to know is this thing called genome. A genome is just your whole set of genetic information. Genome is all of your genes. And so if you're a biologist that studies genomics, you're studying sets of genes within and between species. Proteomics studies the proteins and their properties. And so if the entire set of genetic instructions is a genome, the entire set of proteins is called a proteome. Bioinformatics is the use of computers to store and organize and analyze all of this data. The point of this slide is just to kind of show you that in biology, technology is used. In all of science, technology is used in order to analyze information, store information, organize information, understand what information you're gaining from the subject that you're studying. Another theme of living things is that life requires the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. So most energy comes initially from the sun, and then it's transferred from or transformed from one form to another to make everything possible. Plants take in light energy, it turns into photosynthesis, those things can grow, then we come along and we eat that energy and it's sugars in our body to allow us to work the way that we're supposed to work. So the input of energy initially comes from the sun and is filtered down to everything. If you're asked in an ecosystem, how is energy input? What is the initial energy of input? What's the source? It's going to be the sun. It's solar energy. Energy flows through an ecosystem, generally entering as light and it exits as heat. So in this case, light energy is given to the plants. They convert the sunlight into chemical energy. An organism like this little caterpillar is going to eat that plant and use that chemical energy to get energy and do work and have a metabolism and move around. And as a result, it gives off some heat. We're constantly giving off heat. Whether we're cold or not, we give off heat. You feel it when you sit down on a chair after someone sat there, or you touch something that someone's been had their hands on for a long time. You feel it. You feel the heat that we give off. we're constantly giving off heat, and that's the flow of energy. We've taken it in as chemical energy by consuming food, and we're giving it off as heat energy. Okay, another theme, organisms interact with other organisms in the physical environment. When we're living in our world, we may not realize that we're interacting with other things, but you absolutely are. From the moment you wake up in the morning, you're interacting with bacteria that's in the air because your body's fighting off germs and other things like that. You get in the car and you drive to work or to class, you're interacting with other organisms on the road, other humans. You interact with the grass that you walk on. And we're also interacting with our physical environment, with our non-living environment. You're interacting with the wind and the sun. You are learning and deciding what to wear based on the temperature outside. You put on sunglasses because the sun is too bright. So there's always interactions between you, other organisms, and just the environment. Interactions between organisms include those that benefit both organisms and those in which both organisms are harmed. There's also interactions in which one organism is harmed and one is benefited. That would be like a parasite, right? And interactions affect individual organisms and the way the populations evolve over time. So these interactions can lead to evolution. They can lead to behavioral changes. They can lead to actual physical evolution on the body. Think of a bird. If all of the seeds in the world that these birds feed on become harder, the bird is going to start to evolve a thicker, stronger beak, because only those offspring that have strong beaks are going to eat enough to survive. They're going to have babies, survive, and pass the genes down to their youngsters, so that all you have over time are just birds with strong beaks. Climate change is something that is kind of a little bit controversial. Climate change, by definition, is a directional change in global climate that lasts 3 decades or more. So whether that is global warming, that's climate change to become warmer, or climate change to become cooler. Scientists calculate that the CO2 that human activities have added to the atmosphere has increased the average temperature of the planet by 1 degree Celsius since 1900. So what scientists are determining, or what they are finding, is that there is temperature change, but that's really, really small. That's like the hottest temperature in the summer was 102 last year, and now in 120 years it's going to be 103. It's very, over 100 years plus, there's a slow environmental change. And I think that most people, even if you don't believe in climate change, agree that human interaction plays some sort of a role. Yes. I'm recording and thing. Evolution makes sense of everything we know about living organisms. So we'll cover evolution a lot more in depth at the end of this semester, and I believe it's covered in the next semester also. But evolution explains patterns of unity and diversity in living things. All living things are both unified and extremely diverse. It's kind of really beautiful the way that that happens. Similar traits among organisms are explained by descent from common ancestors. So we have similarities with chimpanzees because at some point way a long time ago, we had a common ancestor, and then it diverged off, chimps and humans, or whatever was a human before it became actual Homo sapien. So differences among organisms are explained by an accumulation of heritable changes. The remarkably diverse forms of life on this planet arose by evolutionary processes. Humans group diverse items according to their similarity and relationships with one another. And we analyze form and function to be able to classify these things. There are new methods of assessing species relationships by comparing DNA sequences. Biologists divide the kingdoms of life into 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Domains bacteria and archaea are prokaryotic, very, very small things, very simple organisms, usually a unicellular thing, just a prokaryotic cell. And eukarya are, of course, eukaryotic organisms. So if you're in the domain eukarya, It includes all living things that we think of. It includes plants, trees, flowers, grass, dogs, chickens, insects, snails, humans, horses, chimpanzees, gorillas. All of these things are in eukarya. Bacteria, of course, is going to be bacteria. Archaea, I think, are like viruses and whatnot. So domain eukarya includes all eukaryotic organisms, and that is further broken down into 3 kingdoms. So I'm sure that there are some um, images in your textbook that you can look at to understand this a little bit better. But there's 3 kingdoms. So eukarya is the most inclusive. And then we're splitting things up: fungus by itself, plants by themselves, and animals by themselves. The main giant difference between the 3 is that plants produce their own food by photosynthesis, fungi absorb nutrients, and animals ingest their food. We have to eat it. We don't just sit in a soup and it gets absorbed into our body, right? So here you've got domain bacteria, domain archaea, very simple. These are super, super, super blown up pictures. And domain eukarya, which is made up of 3 different kingdoms: kingdom plantae, kingdom fungi, and kingdom animalia. And protists are also organism, but just ignore that because that makes this figure more difficult. So like I mentioned before, there's a lot of unity. There's unity and diversity in life, which is kind of an amazing thing. And we look at fossils and other evidence of evolution to determine that diversity and that unity among different things. And there's a really important man, Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you've heard before, and he wrote a book called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And this was written in 1859, quite a while ago, almost 200 years ago. And he basically had 2 major points to his book that were very, very important. He said he found, by doing all of this observation, that species showed evidence of descent with modification. So you have a common ancestor, you descend from that common ancestor, and you're modified, and usually in a way that is beneficial. He said that natural selection is the mechanism behind descent with modification. And so if you look at all of these birds, at some point they had a common ancestor. And from that common ancestor, these different species branched off. The common ancestor had a trait that unifies them, feathers and wings, but there is modification among them. Maybe they diverged into 3 different species because of climate. A penguin needs to have feathers in such a way and feet in such a way and wings in such a way that it doesn't fly, but it can swim very well. A robin, maybe it's beneficial for it to be very small in its environment. A flamingo needs to be able to cool itself off because it's in warmer environments and has developed a way to consume fish in a different way than penguins have. No need to get into the water and swim because it is found in an environment where maybe the water is more shallow and that's where its food is found. So all of these guys are unified in that they're birds, but they're all extremely diverse from one another. And that diversity is a result of having a common ancestor. They diverged from this common ancestor and developed traits that made them more successful in the environment that they're found in. So Darwin observed that individuals in a population vary in their traits, many of which are heritable. So you vary in your traits, and most of the traits that you have you got from mom or dad. More offspring are produced than actually survive, and because of that, competition is inevitable. So even among the human population, we produce more offspring. More children are born than make it to the age of 100, right? Children die as they're being born. Children die within the first year of their life. Fertilized eggs don't ever make it to becoming large enough to be able to be a full grown fetus to be born. So we produce more offspring than we actually have survive, and there's competition among us. In the animal kingdom, this competition would be competition for food or for resources. So don't think of it as competition as like a basketball game in the human world. Species generally suit their environment. You're not going to find penguins in Texas because this environment does not suit them. You're not going to find polar bears in Texas. It's not going to suit them. But you're also probably not going to find an iguana in Antarctica because that environment is not going to suit them. Darwin inferred that individuals that are best suited for their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. So over time, more individuals in a population will have an advantageous trait because the best suited individuals make more babies, more of those babies survive, more of those babies reproduce. In other words, the environment selects for the propagation or the passing on of beneficial traits, and he called this natural selection. So a naturally fit or reproductively fit individual, evolutionarily fit individual would be one that is able to produce 20 offspring and 19 of them survive. An unfit individual would be someone that's able to produce 100 offspring, but only 5 survive, right? Because you're putting a lot of energy into having something not survive. Or you could have an individual that produces 20 offspring, 19 survive, but none of those are able to reproduce themselves. That individual versus somebody who produces 4 offspring, all of whom survive and all of whom reproduce on their own, that person would be more evolutionarily fit because they're passing on good traits and allowing that those genes to continue to be in the population. This is a typical example, classic example of natural selection. Natural selection is a component of evolution. It explains evolution. So what happens is you have a population of these beetles, and they're varying colors, very dark gray and a light color. When you have predators that come in and they're able to see the light individuals, you end up having less and less light individuals out there to pass on their genetic information. And so as time passes, all that's left are the dark ones to be able to reproduce. So the frequency of that trait of being darker enhances their survival, and that's the only trait that sticks around. It's not advantageous to still have a bunch of light-colored beetles because they're found first. So the forelimb of a human, the foreleg of a horse, the flipper of a whale, the wing of a bat, they all share common skeletal architecture. So this is shared anatomical structures. This reflects inheritance of a limb structure from a common ancestor that was similar. So by looking at the forelimb of a human, the foreleg of a horse, the flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat, we can look at that bone structure and we can make an assumption that we all came from a common ancestor. And that, of course, all those things are mammals. And so that's what made mammals who they are, right? Darwin proposed that natural selection could cause an ancestral species to give rise to or more descendant species. For example, the finch species in the Galapagos Islands are descended from a common ancestor. So if you look at these guys, he believed that at one time there was an ancestral finch, and this ancestral finch gave rise to all of these other finches, which are very, very, very diverse, but they're unified in that they're all finches and they had a common ancestor. Okay, so on to the next concept. In studying nature, scientists form and test hypotheses, and you guys are going to do this in lab, hopefully quite a bit. The word science is derived from the Latin verb meaning to know. So we do scientific experiments so that we can learn things. You have a question, you inquire about something, and you're searching for information and an explanation to the question that you have. The scientific process, so there's something called the scientific process, and this includes observing, forming a hypothesis, and testing those hypotheses. Hypotheses are basically educated guesses. They're educated guesses for why something happens. You have a question, you observe something, you form a question in your mind, you give yourself an answer for why you think this is happening, and then you test that and you try to determine if your hypothesis was correct or not. So all biology begins with observations. When we record those observations, it's called recording data. There's different types of data. So there's qualitative data, which doesn't use measurements. So like Jane Goodall kind of gets, by some scientists, a bad rap because all of her data was observational. She just wrote things down, but her observations gave rise to a lot of information about chimpanzee behavior. The second type of data, which is not listed right here, is called quantitative data. And that's where you can measure lengths of things, measure temperature, count things, all things numbers that you can put together into graphs or tables. Inductive reasoning, I would know this term. This draws conclusions from the logical process of induction. And through induction, generalizations are drawn from a large number of observations. So, for example, if the first person who looked under the microscope and found that there were these little cells in every little sliver of skin that they took from a human, they observed that, hey, skin is made up of cells. So in scientists, a hypothesis is a rational accounting for a set of observations guided by inductive reasoning. It is an explanation. It is an educated guess. It predicts something, and it can be tested with additional observations or experiments. An experiment, of course, is a scientific test carried out under controlled situations. So initial observations may lead to multiple hypotheses to be tested. For example, you notice that your lamp doesn't work. You think, why doesn't my lamp work? Well, one hypothesis is the bulb is burnt out. The other hypothesis is that the lamp is broken. Another hypothesis would be that the power is out, right? All of these hypotheses are testable. You can figure that stuff out, plug it into a different place, change the light bulb. Deductive reasoning extrapolates from general premises and specific predictions. The hypothesis is then tested experimentally. The thing about a hypothesis is that you can't ever conclusively prove it to be true because you can never test every single alternative option. So hypotheses gain credibility. They're better hypotheses when they survive multiple attempts at falsification. So usually in an experiment, you don't just do your experiment one time, you do it multiple times so that you're able to know if something was just a freak accident. Hypotheses must be testable and falsifiable. Very few scientific studies actually adhere to the rigidity of the sequence of steps in the scientific method, but you still need to understand the scientific method. So most of the time you formulate and test a hypothesis, then you explore and discover it, then you go back with this information and you test this hypothesis. Maybe you talk to the community, get feedback from a bunch of other scientists about it, then go back in and change your experiment somewhat. Maybe you realize that your experiment probably is socially unacceptable in some way, and so then you go back and form your hypothesis again and retest. So all these things are kind of interactive. It's not quite so observe, question, experiment, get an answer. It's not always quite so rigid. So let's look at like a case study of scientific inquiry here at the end of this chapter. And what this is looking at is coat coloration in mouse populations. So you've got two mouse populations that reside in different habitats, and they have two completely different coat colors. And so the question is, why do they have these different coat colors in their habitats? Well, this might seem kind of common sense, right? You look at this and you say, well, of course, the mouse on top at the beach is lighter in color because it blends in with the light-colored sand. The guy, the same species of mouse, is this the same? Yeah, same species of mouse. They're darker on the top of their body because that blends them in with this kind of grass that's on the inside. So the hypothesis is natural predators of mice are all visual hunters, and so they're colored. It's an adaptation in order to protect them from predation. The prediction, if you put mice with a coloration that doesn't match their habitat, they would suffer heavier predation than the native well-matched mice. And so you start to build, a group is built, this group builds models of mice that resemble either the beach or the inland mice, and they place them randomly in both habitats. And the results showed what was thought, that the camouflage models suffered much lower rates of predation than the ones that didn't. And that makes sense, right? Even you and I can look and see that if it doesn't blend in very well, it's very obvious, and it would be much easier for a predator to find these guys. And it's almost identical, right? As far as predation goes. So light models in the darker habitats have much higher predation than the dark guys, and opposite for beach habitat. So you've ruled out the idea that maybe it's because white ones run faster than the dark ones do. Well, that's not actually the case with the beach habitat, right? It has everything to do, or appears to have everything to do with color. So most experiments are called controlled experiments, and that means that you have an experimental group and a control group. And in the case of the mice, the experimental group was the non-camouflaged ones, and the control group were the camouflaged mice. The control group is where you kind of already know what the answer should be. This is the part that you're not experimenting. It is what you compare your experimental group to. The factor that is manipulated and the effect of that factor are both called experimental variables, and there's independent and dependent variables. So the factor that's manipulated by the researchers, which was color, is the independent variable, and the effect of that independent variable, which is how much predation happens, is called the dependent variable. The dependent variable, the amount of predation, depends on the color of the mice. The color of the mice doesn't depend on anything, right? It's an independent variable. So researchers usually control unwanted variables, not by eliminating them, but by canceling them out by using control groups. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is a theory. A theory is a broader scope than a hypothesis. You can support a theory, but you can never prove that a theory is correct, kind of like with a hypothesis. So they're general enough to lead to new testable hypotheses, but they're supported by a large body of evidence in comparison to a hypothesis. That's supported by a little bit of evidence. So the theory of evolution, it's a theory, but it's supported by a lot of things like fossil records, DNA, homologous features like the arm or the foreleg of the horse or the bird's wing, or the bat's wing, et cetera, et cetera. So the theories are supported by a large body of evidence, but they're still theories. They can't completely be proven.